My name is Purandayal Omacharan, and the title of my thesis is Windstorm Vulnerability and Exposure Analysis on the Coastline of Guyana, an integrated assessment of infrastructure, community, and critical systems. The general objective of the project is to assess the vulnerability and exposure of Guyana's coastline to windstorms, with focus on infrastructure, communities, and critical systems, in order to inform disaster risk reduction and resilience strategies. The specific objective of the project is to evaluate structural vulnerability of coastal infrastructure from windstorm damages, analyze community level of vulnerability and preparedness, and assess the exposure and resilience of critical systems, and finally to integrate spatial and systematic findings through GIS and disaster risk management mapping to identify high-risk zones and to recommend targeted resilience and adaptation strategies. Why choose Guyana as a study site? The country is located on the northeastern coast of South America and is characterized by its low-lying coastal geography. Approximately 90% of the country's population and 75% of the agricultural lands are concentrated along the coastline of the country. The elevation of these lands are between 0.5 to 1 meters below the sea level, making it particularly subjective to flooding and windstorm impacts. The socioeconomic context further complicates the vulnerability of these regions, as high levels of poverty, limited access to social safety nets, and inadequate disaster preparedness and all contributes to the overall risk profile of the communities in regions 4 and 5. The main findings include the residential buildings, especially along the coastline in regions 4 and 5, are highly vulnerable to windstorm damages. Yet current building codes only require wind resistance standards for high-rising structures. Additionally, most homes, particularly older and poorly maintained ones, do not comply with any regional or international standards, largely because wind hazards are often overlooked due to Guyana's location outside of the hurricane belt. Key patterns identified by the study. Based on survey, windstorm damages along the coastline of regions 4 and 5 are mostly common within 0.5 to 3 kilometers of the offshore. These areas include majority of the man-made infrastructure in both regions and a large section of the farmlands in Region 5. Buildings that are found to be susceptible to windstorm damages are the older homes, which are 30 years and older, especially those that are closer to the foreshore and lack proper or regular maintenance. However, not just the older homes are subjected to these damages. The newer buildings are also at risk, although at a lesser degree. This has indicated a broader issue with the construction practices in Guyana, which may have been caused by, as mentioned earlier, a lack of building codes in addition to the coastal exposure of these areas. In terms of community vulnerability, key findings reveal that the vulnerability zone extends from the foreshore to 3 kilometers inland, which encompasses 90% of the communities along the coastline of both regions, which affects thousands, as majority of the population of the country can be found along the coastline, including children whose education may be disrupted and the elderly. Next, the section of the communities that are most vulnerable are the squatter settlements, which are in close proximity to the foreshore, as their homes are often built with substandard material and built with minimal formal standards. The inhabitants of these structures include fishermen, the unemployed, and Venezuelan migrants. Community preparedness and response to windstorms. Currently, there are no early warning systems in Guyana. However, in 2025, the government began working with international agencies to implement a multi-hazard early warning system. However, in the absence of this early warning system, the Civil Defense Commission, or the CDC, utilizes a 4-phase disaster management cycle, which includes mitigation, preparedness, and response and recovery. This includes, when a disaster occurs, a rapid assessment, followed by a distribution of emergency supplies where is needed in collaboration with local agencies. In concluding, the findings points to an urgent need for stricter coastal development policies, enforcement of building codes of all residential structures, implementation of an effective warning system, and lastly, targeted support for vulnerable groups in high-risk coastal zones. These steps are critical to reducing the impact of increasingly recurring windstorm events across Guyana coastal region. Thanks.